I was still halfway through my morning coffee when I heard it, the sharp, unmistakable sound of a camera shutter clicking outside my window. I peeked through the blinds and nearly spit my drink. There she was, Karen Hughes, the self-proclaimed queen of the Homeowners Association, wearing her oversized sunglasses, clutching a clipboard, and aiming her phone camera directly at my dock like she was auditioning for a detective show. A seagull swooped overhead and screeched as if mocking her. She stepped back dramatically, took another picture, and yelled toward my house that she had all the evidence she needed. Evidence of what? That my fishing boat, the same one that had been in the exact same spot for 5 years, was apparently a national threat to her HOA aesthetic. That was the moment I knew I was about to spend my week in battle with a woman who thought bylaws were commandments from heaven. I walked out to greet her, half amused and half irritated. She jumped a little when she realized I was there, then recovered instantly, squaring her shoulders like a sheriff in an old western. She announced in her crisp, over-rehearsed HOA voice that I was in direct violation of community storage regulations because boats may not be docked on private property without prior visual concealment. I almost laughed. Visual concealment? It was a boat on a lake. That's like hiding a cow in a field. I asked her if she was serious, and she produced a printed notice already signed, dated, and folded in a manila envelope like she'd been waiting all week to hand it to someone. She slapped it against my chest and said she'd already reported the violation to the HOA board. The penalty? A $500 fine and mandatory removal of the boat within 72 hours. I looked past her to the water, where the sun glinted off the aluminum hull of my old fishing boat. The irony was almost cinematic. Behind her, tied neatly to her own dock, was her prized pontoon boat, the one she constantly bragged about during HOA meetings. I pointed at it and asked if that counted as an illegal storage unit too. She flinched, then smirked and said hers was approved under a temporary variance. For the next few minutes, I let her talk, mostly because it was entertaining. Karen loved the sound of her own voice, especially when she thought she was enforcing order. She went on about property values, community image, and preserving the lakeside harmony. I asked her if the Coast Guard had recently started patrolling suburban ponds because apparently my 12-foot fishing boat was now a maritime hazard. She didn't appreciate the sarcasm. I could see her cheeks redden beneath her foundation as she stammered about how wouldn't be laughing when legal action followed. Then, in a burst of theatrical frustration, she turned and marched back up the path, nearly tripping on a sprinkler head. I watched her retreat, shaking my head. This was going to get ridiculous fast, and I could already feel the story brewing. The notice she left was typed in perfect HOA legalese, vague enough to sound official, but hollow enough to mean nothing. Still, I couldn't ignore it completely. The last thing I needed was some administrative technicality giving her leverage. So I decided to double-check everything. I dug out the HOA's bylaw packet from the bottom drawer in my office, the one nobody ever reads after moving in. Sure enough, Section 8.2, Recreational Equipment and Vehicles, prohibited unsightly items visible from neighboring lots, but it said nothing about watercraft moored on privately owned docks. In fact, the addendum from 3 years ago, ironically signed by Karen herself, clearly stated that water vehicles registered under the state's recreational boating license are exempt when stored on property with direct lake access. My registration was valid, up to date, and stuck right on the side of the hull. I smiled. She was wrong, and not just wrong, embarrassingly wrong. Later that afternoon, I took my boat out for a short spin across the lake. The weather was perfect, the kind of quiet afternoon that makes you forget suburban politics even exist. But when I returned, I found something wedged under my windshield wiper. It was another notice, this time handwritten in red ink. You have been observed operating an unregistered vessel in violation of HOA and state codes, it read, followed by a dramatic underline. Failure to comply will result in escalation. At the bottom, in big looping handwriting, was Karen's signature. But what caught my attention wasn't the paper, it was the card tucked behind it. A white business card with a navy blue logo, United States Coast Guard Auxiliary. Someone had left it there quietly, maybe a joke, maybe fate, but it gave me an idea so delicious I almost laughed out loud on the dock. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up local Coast Guard auxiliary regulations just to see what was actually enforceable. What I found made my grin widen with every paragraph. The HOA had no jurisdiction over maritime storage, none. Not even the smallest homeowner covenant could override federal waterway law. In fact, if Karen was threatening people using falsified marine code, she was technically impersonating an enforcement authority. That could get her in serious trouble. And then I stumbled across something even better. There was a database for registered recreational watercraft accessible by anyone, and when I searched the Hughes household, her pontoon didn't show up. No registration number, no inspection tag, nothing. Either she hadn't renewed it or she'd never filed properly in the first place. I thought about that business card again. Someone out there, maybe one of the volunteers from the auxiliary, had been watching her little empire of rules. I wasn't sure if they'd left the card as a warning or an invitation, but either way, it gave me an opening I couldn't resist. Over the next 2 days, I collected everything. Her notices, copies of the bylaws, even the photos she'd posted in the HOA group chat. Bragging about her flawless compliance. I packaged it all neatly into a timeline and drafted an email that could have been mistaken for a legal memo. The subject line was simple: possible false reporting and vessel compliance concerns, Hughes residence. I attached the photos she'd sent, including one where her unregistered pontoon's serial number was visible. I didn't send it immediately. Part of me wanted to give her one last chance to walk it back, but Karen wasn't the kind to retreat. The next morning, I woke to find a bright orange notice taped to my garage door. Final warning, it screamed in bold letters, followed by a ridiculous threat about further disciplinary action. That was it. I hit send. The email went out to the Coast Guard Auxiliary's local office, CC'd to the County Boating Compliance Department. 10 minutes later, I got an automated acknowledgement. By noon, I got a real reply, a polite, professional note saying the report had been forwarded to the Regional Compliance Unit for verification. When I saw Karen that evening walking her little dog along the lakefront, she gave me a smug wave, completely unaware that her world was about to shift. I waved back cheerfully, my boat gleaming behind me in the sunset. For once, I didn't feel angry. I just felt amused. I had learned long ago that the best revenge wasn't loud or messy, it was letting people trap themselves in the rules they invented. And as Karen strutted past, reciting something about community image, I glanced again at her pontoon boat bobbing gently on the water, its empty registration plate glinting like a ticking clock. She wanted a battle over boats? Fine. But soon, she'd be answering to someone with a lot more authority than an HOA clipboard. Karen's arrogance didn't take long to resurface. The day after I'd sent that email, she stood outside my house again, this time wearing a bright floral sun hat and holding a megaphone like she was hosting a parade. She was showing a few other board members where violations supposedly existed along the lakeside properties. I could hear her voice booming across the water, talking about unsanctioned modifications and unsafe structures. I watched from my porch as she pointed toward my dock like she was leading a crime scene investigation. One of the men beside her looked uncomfortable and mumbled that my dock had been inspected last year with no issues. Karen waved him off with a dismissive flick of her hand. Her voice had that shrill pitch that meant she was running out of logic and leaning hard on performance. I could tell she wasn't just trying to find me, she wanted a spectacle. That was her fuel, public humiliation disguised as rule enforcement. Later that evening, she called an emergency HOA meeting. I wasn't required to attend, but I went anyway, mostly because I wanted to see how far she'd take this farce. The meeting was held in the community hall, a beige room that always smelled faintly of air freshener and tension. When I walked in, Karen was already standing at the front with a projector screen displaying photos of my property. She'd circled the boat in red and written, "Illegal storage," in capital letters. She started talking about the dangerous precedent of ignoring regulations, pacing back and forth like a prosecutor. I raised my hand calmly and asked if she'd like to read Section 8.2 aloud, the one she herself had signed. She blinked, clearly not expecting anyone to call her bluff. I offered to read it for her, and when I did, the room went silent. A few members exchanged awkward glances. Karen's jaw tightened. She muttered something about outdated versions, and claimed the board was revising the language. That was her pattern, when proven wrong, change the rules. I'd seen her pull that move on neighbors before. Last year, she tried to ban inflatable pool toys because she thought they lowered community dignity. The year before that, she fined an elderly man for hanging a wind chime, visible from the street. Most people gave in just to avoid the headache, but I wasn't most people. I wasn't about to let her rewrite reality because her ego couldn't handle being contradicted. As the meeting ended, I noticed one of the board members, a quiet guy named Alan, slip me a folded note as we walked out. It simply said, "You're right. Check the marina permits." That was enough to spark a new curiosity in me. That night, I looked up the county's marina and vessel registration record. They were public, which made things interesting. I found a list of every registered vessel on the lake, along with their inspection dates. My name was there, properly filed, properly renewed. Karen's wasn't. The pontoon wasn't registered, insured, or even permitted for operation in public water. And here she was, threatening me with fake infractions while technically operating an illegal vessel herself. The hypocrisy was astounding, even by HOA standards. I saved screenshots, downloaded PDFs, and archived every document. I was building a wall of proof so tall she'd need more than a clipboard to climb over it. The next day, Karen's intimidation escalated. She sent a group text to the HOA chat accusing me of harassment and noncompliance. She wrote paragraphs about how certain homeowners refuse to respect the shared beauty of our community, and claimed she'd already notified the authorities. Within minutes, my phone buzzed with messages from neighbors. Some were sympathetic, others were cautious, telling me to just let it go. But there was always one in every neighborhood who secretly wanted to see the tyrant fall, and for me, that was Alan. He stopped by that evening, nervously glancing around like he was part of a spy exchange. He told me Karen had been bragging that she was connected to the local zoning office and that her friends in code enforcement would make sure I paid. I asked him if she really believed that. He laughed quietly and said she believed anything that made her feel powerful. Then he told me something else, that the HOA's insurance policy didn't actually cover her misuse of authority. If she overstepped her bounds, she'd be personally liable. That detail lit a fuse in my mind. I decided to play the long game. I spent the next few days pretending to comply, making small talk whenever she passed by, even thanking her for helping maintain standards. It was torture for her ego. She wanted me angry. Calmness unsettled her. Meanwhile, I kept feeding bits of information to the Coast Guard contact I'd found through the auxiliary office. I didn't tell them everything yet, just enough to pique their interest. Photos of her pontoon, notes from the HOA meetings, and her written notices claiming authority she didn't have. The officer I spoke to was polite but curious. He said they'd received similar complaints in nearby communities about private associations misrepresenting maritime authority. That's when I realized this wasn't just personal, it was part of a bigger issue. Karen had turned a local HOA into her personal kingdom, but the Coast Guard didn't play those games. By the weekend, Karen organized what she called a lakeside cleanliness initiative. It was basically an excuse to parade her authority again, handing out trash bags and lecturing people about responsible lake ownership. I showed up with my boat polished to a shine, every permit taped visibly on the hull, and a smile that said I knew something she didn't. She scowled when she saw me. Then, in front of half the neighborhood, she made a grand show of telling me that my compliance efforts were appreciated but overdue. I could see the cameras from other homeowners recording her. She didn't realize every word was digging her deeper. I asked her if her pontoon would also be inspected during this cleanliness drive. The color drained from her face. She stammered something about already being inspected. That was a lie, and I had the records to prove it. That evening, I received an unexpected call from a man who introduced himself as Commander Ellis from the Regional Coast Guard office. He thanked me for the documentation and asked a few clarifying questions about the HOA. President's claims of enforcing maritime codes. He sounded calm but serious. I told him everything, how she'd issued fake citations, threatened residents with non-existent laws, and even implied she had authority over water safety. He said that impersonating or falsely representing maritime authority, even indirectly, was a serious federal offense. He didn't say what would happen next, but the pause before he thanked me again told me everything I needed to know. The next morning, Karen seemed unusually nervous. She was pacing outside her house, talking on her phone in a hushed tone. Her husband stood by the dock, pretending to clean the pontoon but mostly avoiding eye contact with anyone. By afternoon, rumors spread fast. Someone said 2 Coast Guard officers had visited the local permit office asking for vessel record. Another said they'd seen a government vehicle parked near the HOA's administrative shed. I didn't confirm any of it, but I didn't need to. The tension was thick enough to taste. Karen canceled the next HOA meeting, claiming unexpected scheduling conflicts. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt peaceful. No patrols, no warnings, no megaphones. Just quiet. People started waving to me again, even thanking me under their breath. It was as if the spell of fear she'd cast had finally broken. I spent the evening on my porch, watching the lake shimmer in the twilight. My boat floated quietly, perfectly legal, perfectly mine. But the best part was the silence from Karen's dock. Her pontoon sat untouched, its once gleaming cover now gathering dust. I had a feeling she knew what was coming, but I also knew the real storm hadn't hit yet. And when it did, she'd learn that the water she tried to control could drown her in her own arrogance. The quiet didn't last long. By Monday morning, Karen was back in full force, though her confidence seemed slightly cracked around the edges. She wore her usual pastel blazer, but her voice carried an unfamiliar strain when she called for an unscheduled inspection of lakefront property safety standards. The irony was almost funny, given that her own pontoon sat there unregistered and technically illegal, but she couldn't help herself. Control wasn't just her habit, it was her survival mechanism. She thrived on being obeyed. I decided to let her dig deeper into her own hole. When she knocked on my door with her clipboard and artificial smile, I greeted her politely and stepped aside, inviting her to inspect whatever she liked. That threw her off balance. She wasn't expecting cooperation. She fumbled through a few lines about safety, peeked at my neatly moored boat, and tried to find something, anything, wrong. She couldn't. Everything was spotless, labeled, and compliant. Her fake smile wavered, and I saw the flicker of frustration flash behind her eyes. Then she pointed vaguely toward the dock and said she'd need to verify the materials used for construction. I told her she could check the county record since the dock had been approved years ago, long before her reign of pettiness began. She mumbled something about standards changing and left in a hurry. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the Coast Guard auxiliary officer I'd spoken with earlier. His tone was more formal this time. He informed me that an ongoing review of my HOA's activity had revealed multiple complaints from different residents across the county about similar false claims of maritime authority. My submission had apparently confirmed a pattern. He didn't name Karen directly, but I didn't have to read between the lines. They were watching her now. The email mentioned that the Coast Guard had reached out to local law enforcement to coordinate an inquiry into vessel compliance, and my documentation had been forwarded to the Regional Enforcement Division. My heart skipped slightly as I realized what that meant. They were treating this seriously, not as a neighborhood spat but as a matter of legal jurisdiction. Karen had picked the wrong playground to police. The next couple of days, subtle changes rippled through the community. Karen was quieter during her walks. Her husband started moving their pontoon farther away from the main dock under the pretense of repairs. A few curious neighbors noticed and began whispering. Then came the best part. Someone posted anonymously on the HOA message board asking if it was true that the HOA president's own boat wasn't registered. The post lasted less than 10 minutes before it was deleted, but that was enough. The rumor spread faster than fire in dry grass. By evening, half the neighborhood was talking. The same people who used to nod nervously when Karen spoke were now laughing behind her back. It was the first time I'd seen her power wobble. The Queen's crown was slipping, and she knew it. That week, Alan dropped by again, this time looking more relaxed. He told me that during a private board session, Karen had snapped at another member who questioned her about the missing registration paperwork. She apparently shouted that, "The Coast Guard has no jurisdiction here," which only made things worse. The treasurer reminded her that all board members were personally liable for any fraudulent communication made under the HOA's name. The argument escalated until Karen stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door so hard that the framed Community Excellence certificate fell off the wall. I couldn't help but laugh at the mental image. The same woman who demanded residents mow their lawns twice a week was now drowning in her own bureaucratic swamp. Around that time, I noticed a dark SUV parked near the lake for most of an afternoon. Two men stood by the water, talking quietly while taking note. They didn't wear uniforms, but one had a small badge clipped to his belt. They inspected several boats, including mine, and waved politely when I came down to greet them. One introduced himself as part of a maritime compliance team working in coordination with the Coast Guard's civilian branch. He thanked me for maintaining proper documentation and mentioned that they were conducting random verification checks due to recent misuse of federal references by local organizations. His tone carried a subtle amusement, like he already knew exactly who they were really there for. When I asked if this had anything to do with my HOA, he just smiled and said, "We're looking into it." That evening, I saw Karen pacing near her dock again. Her husband was untying the pontoon in a panic, trying to move it to a neighbor's slip temporarily. But one of the inspectors approached them before they could. From my porch, I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. The stiff body language, the clipped gestures, the way Karen's hands kept fluttering defensively told the whole story. After about 15 minutes, the officers walked away, leaving her standing there pale and furious. The next morning, her pontoon was gone entirely. Someone later said it had been towed to the county marina for inspection, though no one knew exactly who ordered it. The neighborhood chat was chaos for the next 2 days. People speculated wildly. Some thought Karen had been caught with expired permit. Others claimed she'd been fined for misrepresenting HOA authority to residents. A few brave souls even posted jokes about her holding emergency boat sale fundraisers. She tried to issue a formal HOA statement declaring everything a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. The once terrified homeowners now treated her emails like spam. Several even requested a vote of no confidence to remove her as president. For someone who built her identity around control, losing it must have felt like drowning. But the real twist came later that week when I received another message from the Coast Guard representative. He thanked me again for my cooperation and informed me that during their inquiry, they discovered multiple inconsistencies in the HOA's safety inspection reports. Apparently, Karen had been submitting fabricated data to justify fines and policy changes, claiming community marine safety hazards without proper evidence. that not only violated HOA guidelines but also bordered on fraud since she used those reports to collect extra member fees. I sat there reading the email 3 times, amazed by how deep her obsession with power ran. She hadn't just targeted me, she'd built an entire illusion of authority to feed her ego. The following weekend, I went to the marina to check on my boat, and to my surprise, I saw Karen's pontoon sitting there roped off with an orange tag. It looked pitiful without its shiny covers or decorations. Tag read, "Vessel hold pending compliance verification." I couldn't resist taking a picture, though I didn't post it anywhere. Some moments were too perfect to ruin with words. I just wanted to remember it, the visual proof that karma, when patient, has impeccable timing. When I returned home, I found Karen waiting near my driveway. Her face was tight with anger, but her tone was oddly subdued. She accused me of overreacting, and said I'd brought unnecessary attention to the neighborhood. I told her calmly that I hadn't done anything she hadn't started. She snapped that the Coast Guard had no right to interfere and that her legal team would clear everything soon. I asked her which legal team that was, the one that ignored bylaws or the one that rewrote them mid-meeting. That shut her up. She turned red, muttered something under her breath, and stormed off. I didn't stop her. There was nothing left to say. In the days that followed, Karen's control over the HOA evaporated completely. The board called an emergency election, and she was temporarily suspended pending investigation into misuse of authority. Word spread that the Coast Guard report had been forwarded to the State Housing Department, which was reviewing whether her actions constituted harassment or fraud. For the first time in years, the residents of our community seemed genuinely relaxed. Kids rode bikes without being scolded for helmet color, people parked where they liked without fearing a photo on the next newsletter, and the lake was full of laughter instead of lectures. I spent one of those quiet evenings sitting at the end of my dock, legs dangling over the water. The lake reflected the golden sunset like a mirror, and I thought about how fast things had turned. A month ago, I was the target of Karen's relentless campaign for control. Now, she was the subject of an official inquiry by the very institution she pretended to represent. I didn't feel triumph as much as relief. Justice didn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it just arrived quietly, carried by the ripple of consequences. I had simply nudged the first domino, and watched the rest fall in perfect order. And as I looked across the water at the empty space where her pontoon used to be, I couldn't help smiling. The lake was calm again, the air was clear, and for once, the only rules that mattered were the ones written by nature itself. The silence that followed Karen's suspension felt almost unnatural, like the air after a thunderstorm when everything is too still, too perfect. But deep down I knew she wouldn't vanish quietly. People like Karen didn't know how to surrender, they only regrouped. For a few days, the neighborhood settled into an uneasy calm. The HOA meetings were postponed, the constant stream of threatening emails stopped, and even the laminated flyers she loved to hang on everyone's mailboxes disappeared. It was strange walking past her house and seeing the curtains drawn, no clipboard on the porch, no dog yapping at strangers. I thought maybe, just maybe, she had learned something. But the universe, as usual, had other plans. On Friday morning, a delivery truck pulled up outside her home. The workers unloaded folding tables, banners, and boxes labeled Lake Day Festival supplies. I nearly laughed out loud. She was planning an event. After being investigated by the Coast Guard and suspended from her post, she was still trying to put on a show. It was pure Karen. If she couldn't rule through authority, she'd try to reclaim control through spectacle. By the next day, she had plastered posters all over the community entrance. Lakeside Restoration Celebration, hosted by friends of the HOA. The wording was deliberate. She couldn't legally act as HOA president anymore, but nothing stopped her from forming friends of committees to manipulate the same people. The poster promised food stalls, live music, and a presentation on safe lake usage. I couldn't help but notice how carefully she avoided mentioning who would be giving that presentation. My bet was she planned to turn it into another thinly veiled lecture about her innocence and how she was the victim of a misunderstanding. The sheer nerve of it all was both infuriating and hilarious. I decided I'd attend, not because I cared about the event, but because I wanted to see what brand of chaos she'd unleash next. The morning of the festival was bright and warm. The lake shimmered like glass under the sun, and people were genuinely in good spirits for the first time in a while. Food trucks lined the street, kids played near the docks, and music drifted through the air. For a moment it almost felt normal, until Karen appeared. She stepped onto the temporary stage they'd built near the shoreline, dressed in a flowing blue dress that made her look like she was auditioning for the role of community savior. She held a microphone and started her speech with dramatic pauses and hand gestures. She thanked everyone for standing by truth and transparency, and subtly blamed false rumors for recent distractions. It was impressive how she managed to twist every sentence into a plea for sympathy while pretending to celebrate unity. I watched her closely, waiting for her to slip. And then she did. Halfway through her speech, she motioned toward the lake and proudly announced that her pontoon had passed all necessary inspections and would be returning that very afternoon. The crowd clapped politely, but I saw Alan in the back shaking his head in disbelief. That single statement changed everything. Because as far as I knew, her boat was still being held for non-compliance at the marina. Either she was lying outright, or she was trying to bluff her way through a problem she hadn't solved. I decided to make a little phone call. Stepping away from the crowd, I contacted the local marina office and asked about the Hughes vessel. The man on the line confirmed it was still there, still flagged, and awaiting Coast Guard clearance before release. That meant Karen had just publicly declared her boat legal when it was under active investigation. I didn't have to do much after that. Her own arrogance would handle the rest. I rejoined the festival, pretending nothing had happened, while Karen strutted through the crowd shaking hands and posing for pictures as if she were a celebrity. The real storm rolled in later that afternoon, both literally and figuratively. Dark clouds gathered over the lake as wind rippled the water. The event was still in full swing when a white truck with the Coast Guard auxiliary logo pulled up near the dock. Two officers stepped out, calm but purposeful. The music faded as people turned to watch them. Karen froze mid-conversation, the smile on her face stiffening like drying paint. The officers spoke to her quietly for a few moments, and whatever they said drained the color from her face. She tried to gesture toward the crowd as if convincing them she had it handled, but the murmurs had already started. The officers then moved toward the small side dock where, to my absolute astonishment, Karen's pontoon had indeed returned. It was floating there, freshly cleaned, as if she had secretly arranged its delivery before the event to make her story believable. The officers climbed aboard and started their inspection while Karen stood on the dock wringing her hands. It didn't take long. Within minutes, one of them called out to the other and pointed at the serial number plate. I saw the flash of a camera and the sound of a radio crackle. Then, in a moment of perfect poetic timing, lightning split the sky somewhere beyond the lake, and thunder rolled across the water. The officers spoke briefly to Karen again before one of them secured the pontoon to their own towline. The sight of her boat being pulled away in front of the entire neighborhood was almost cinematic. People tried not to stare, but the whispers were deafening. Karen's composure broke completely. She shouted something about unfair targeting and false accusations, but her words were drowned out by the wind and the hum of the tow engine. Within minutes, her precious pontoon was gone again, disappearing down the road like a symbol of every lie she'd ever told floating out of reach. As the rain began to fall, the festival dissolved into chaos. Vendors packed up, families rushed home, and the once celebratory atmosphere evaporated. Karen, drenched and furious, stood alone on the dock yelling at no one in particular. I stayed under a tent, quietly sipping coffee and watching her unravel. It wasn't joy I felt, It was a deep, quiet satisfaction that truth had finally spoken louder than her noise. Alan walked over and joined me, shaking his head. He whispered that the board would likely move to permanently remove her after this disaster. I told him they wouldn't need to. She'd already destroyed herself. The following days were surreal. The neighborhood group chat exploded with theories and memes. Someone posted a photo of the Coast Guard truck captioned, HOA Patrol 2.0, and it spread faster than wildfire. Karen tried to post a defense, claiming her documentation was misplaced, but no one bought it. The board issued a statement clarifying that she was no longer affiliated with the HOA and that all past fines issued under her direction were being reviewed for reimbursement. That alone turned her few remaining supporters against her. When people's money gets involved, loyalty evaporates fast. By the end of the week, she had become a ghost of her former self. The same residents who once cowered at her clipboard now laughed when they passed her house. But one last twist still lingered. I got another call from the Coast Guard Auxiliary, this time from Commander Ellis himself. He thanked me again for my cooperation and told me their investigation had uncovered multiple instances of document falsification tied to Karen's name, including fabricated inspection reports. While the case wouldn't lead to criminal charges, she would be fined heavily and blacklisted from serving in any community or safety-related leadership roles. He chuckled lightly and said, "You might want to keep an eye out for a for sale sign soon." That line stuck with me. I thanked him and hung up, feeling an odd mix of closure and disbelief at how far things had spiraled from a simple argument over a fishing boat. A week later, sure enough, a bright red for sale sign appeared on Karen's front lawn. The once perfectly manicured hedges looked overgrown, and the decorative lights she'd obsessed over were dark. Her husband left early every morning and came back late, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The pontoon, I heard, was still impounded. It was as if her entire world had deflated like a balloon losing air. And yet, I couldn't help thinking how all of it began with her need to dominate something she didn't understand. Control had been her oxygen, and without it, she was suffocating. That evening, I took my boat out again, the lake calm and silver under the fading sun. I could still see the outline of Karen's dock in the distance, empty and silent. As the motor hummed softly, I realized something that made me smile, not just about winning, but about balance. People like Karen always believe they're untouchable because they hide behind authority. But when real authority shows up, their power dissolves. The Coast Guard hadn't just taken her boat, they'd taken her illusion. I drifted a little longer, letting the quiet wash over me. The sky was streaked with orange and gold, and for the first time in weeks, there was no shouting, no drama, no fines. Just peace, water, and the satisfying certainty that the lake had finally chosen sides. The morning after Karen's for sale sign went up, the neighborhood was buzzing like it hadn't in years. People who once avoided eye contact at the mailbox were now standing in driveways laughing, trading stories, and acting as though they'd all survived the same war together. There was a strange relief in the air, the kind that only comes when a long reign of quiet tyranny ends. But even as things calmed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't quite finished. Karen wasn't the type to fade away gracefully. She still had her pride, and pride never dies quietly. I suspected she'd try to rebuild her image one more time before disappearing, and as it turned out, I was right. 3 days later, she was back on the neighborhood chat group under a new name, Concerned Lakeside Citizen. Her tone was softer now, even polite, as she posted long messages about community restoration and moving forward with dignity. She never mentioned herself directly, but everyone knew it was her. People reacted with a mix of mockery and pity. It was like watching someone cling to a crown made of paper after the kingdom had burned down. I decided not to respond. Sometimes silence is louder than any insult. Instead, I focused on my own plans for the summer, fixing up the boat, repainting the dock, and enjoying the freedom that had been missing for so long. The water felt different now, cleaner somehow, as if it too had been freed from the constant tension. But then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while I was cleaning the deck, a white sedan pulled up near Karen's house, followed by another black SUV with government plates. I paused, curious. The two men from the Coast Guard Auxiliary stepped out again, this time accompanied by someone in plain clothes holding a clipboard. They spoke briefly with Karen's husband, who stood at the edge of the driveway looking like he wanted to vanish. Karen appeared a few moments later, her hair tied back, her expression tired but defiant. They spoke for nearly 20 minutes. There was no shouting this time, no performance, just quiet conversation and a lot of head shaking. Eventually, one of the officers handed her an envelope, said something, and the group walked away. She stood there alone, staring at the paper in her hand like it was a death certificate. Whatever was inside, it was clear it wasn't good news. The next morning, word spread that Karen had been officially fined by the Coast Guard for falsifying vessel compliance documents and unauthorized use of federal designations in HOA materials. The fine wasn't small either. Alan told me during our morning walk that it was in the thousands, enough to wipe out any illusion that she could bounce back easily. The community board had already voted to permanently ban her from serving in any position, even as a volunteer. Her remaining supporters, what few she had, quietly distanced themselves. For the first time since she'd moved in, her house looked truly empty, curtains open but lifeless, the garden untrimmed, the flower beds wilting. It was strange to see it that way, stripped of all her false perfection. The same woman who once scolded people for having mismatched shutters now lived in the most neglected house on the block. It was poetic in a way that nature itself seemed to approve of. But Karen wasn't done trying to salvage her reputation. Later that week, she attempted one final act of defiance. She organized a goodbye gathering at the lake, inviting neighbors through printed flyers that mysteriously appeared in mailboxes overnight. The tone was humble, almost apologetic. She wanted to clear the air and share her side of the story. Most people ignored it, assuming it would be another self-serving speech, but curiosity has a way of pulling people toward drama. By late afternoon, a small crowd had gathered near the dock. I went too, not because I wanted to hear her excuses, but because I wanted to see how she'd try to rewrite history one last time. She stood on the dock, wind blowing through her hair, speaking softly about misunderstandings and lessons learned. She said she only wanted what was best for the community, that her intentions had been misread, and that she never meant for things to escalate. But beneath the fragile calm of her voice, there was still that unmistakable tone of self-righteousness, the refusal to admit she was ever truly wrong. When she finished, a few polite claps broke the silence, mostly out of discomfort. Then, as if on cue from the universe's sense of humor, another white truck rolled up at the far end of the lake. This time it wasn't the Coast Guard. It was a county assessor, accompanied by a local news crew filming a short segment on lake compliance enforcement. Someone must have tipped them off about the recent events, maybe even the Coast Guard themselves. They started filming interviews near the boat ramps, asking residents about the incident with the HOA and the false fines. When Karen realized they were there, her composure cracked. She tried to walk away quietly, but the reporter recognized her name and called out to ask if she'd like to comment on the investigation that led to her resignation. She froze. Every camera turned toward her. The silence stretched. She mumbled something about privacy and rushed toward her car, ignoring everyone calling after her. The cameras followed her for a moment before panning back to the lake. It was over. Any hope she had of repairing her image drowned right there in front of the entire community. After that, the for sale sign came down and a moving truck appeared within the week. The house emptied fast. Furniture, boxes, and decor all loaded up with mechanical precision. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. The morning she left, I happened to be on my porch, sipping coffee as her SUV rolled past. For a split second our eyes met. She looked smaller somehow, deflated, her usual sharp expression replaced by exhaustion. I didn't wave. She didn't either. The car disappeared down the road, leaving nothing behind but the faint smell of wet asphalt after the morning rain. And just like that, the woman who'd turned our peaceful neighborhood into a battlefield was gone. The weeks that followed felt almost magical in their normalcy. The HOA restructured under Alan's leadership, and for the first time, meetings were civil, brief, and focused on real community needs. People volunteered to repaint the docks, organize fishing weekends, and even start a small community garden near the entrance. It felt like a different world entirely. One evening, the Coast Guard auxiliary officers visited the lake again, not for enforcement but for a friendly safety demonstration. They brought brochures, answered questions, and even complimented me on how well-maintained my boat was. Alan joked that I should run for HOA president now that peace had been restored. I laughed and told him I'd rather keep my sanity. We both knew it was better this way. But the most satisfying moment came unexpectedly. A month later, while walking through the marina, I overheard two men discussing a recent public report from the Coast Guard Auxiliary. They were talking about Karen, apparently. Her name had been used as a case study in their regional training program for misrepresentation of authority by private organizations. I couldn't believe it at first, but they showed me a printed slide with her redacted title. It was surreal knowing she'd become an example of what not to do nationwide. Her obsession with control had elevated her to infamy. I left the marina that day with an odd sense of closure. I hadn't just outlasted her. I'd helped expose something bigger than our small neighborhood drama. Sometimes I thought back to the moment it all started, the sound of her camera clicking outside my window, the smugness in her voice as she handed me that first notice. It amazed me how that single act of arrogance had spiraled into a full-blown downfall. People like her never think beyond the next threat or the next rule they can weaponize. They believe they're untouchable because they hide behind paper, procedure, and fear. But when they finally collide with real accountability, they crumble faster than anyone expects. I didn't need revenge. Life had done that for me. All I'd done was shine a little light on the truth, and the truth had done the rest. Now, when I look out across the lake, I see reflections instead of battles. The water is peaceful, the air lighter. Kids laugh on the docks again, and no one worries about being fined for hanging a hammock or storing a kayak. Every ripple across that calm surface reminds me of the chaos that once was and how easily peace can be stolen by someone desperate for power. I keep the Coast Guard business card tucked in my wallet as a reminder, not of the fight, but of the lesson. Sometimes the best justice isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet, steady return of calm after a storm that everyone thought would never end. The sun was already setting when I realized the lake finally belonged to peace again. The water shimmered like glass, reflecting streaks of orange and pink that seemed to erase every trace of the chaos that had once consumed our quiet community. The last few months had been a slow, strange recovery, and although everyone had moved on, there was still an unspoken understanding between us all. We had lived under the rule of one woman's obsession, and somehow we had survived it. Sometimes I'd catch myself walking past Karen's old house, now owned by a young couple who had no idea of the drama that once lived there. They had repainted the walls, planted new flowers, and even built a small swing in the yard. It was strange to see life return to a place that had once radiated tension. Every time I saw them wave from the porch, I felt a quiet satisfaction, like the neighborhood had taken its first real breath in years. Life became ordinary again, the kind of ordinary that feels like a luxury after too much conflict. The HOA meetings under Alan's leadership were calm and almost boring, which was exactly what everyone wanted. No more surprise inspections, no random fines, no petty wars over lawn decorations. Instead, we talked about small things that actually mattered, like fixing the playground fence or installing new lights along the path. People smiled again. There was laughter at the meetings, and even disagreements were polite. It was amazing how quickly balance returned once fear was gone. Still, I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to Karen since she left. I hadn't heard anything, and part of me didn't want to. Some stories are better when they end quietly. That peace lasted until one afternoon when a letter arrived in my mailbox. It was from the Coast Guard Auxiliary, printed on the same white paper with the navy blue logo that had started everything. For a moment, my heart skipped, wondering if somehow the drama had found its way back. But when I opened it, I smiled. It was a thank you letter, formal but sincere, acknowledging my assistance in reporting and documenting improper representation of maritime authority. It went on to say that my case had helped them implement new guidelines to prevent similar incidents across other communities. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. There was a quiet pride in knowing that something small and personal had rippled outward into something meaningful. I hadn't just stopped a bully, I'd changed the system that allowed her to exist. The next few weeks passed without incident. Summer deepened, and the lake became the center of everyone's joy again. Families picnicked by the shore, teenagers learned to kayak, and the sound of laughter replaced the echoes of confrontation. One evening, I was out on my boat when I saw Alan waving from his dock. He yelled across the water that the new homeowners were hosting a neighborhood barbecue that weekend, and that I had no choice but to attend. I laughed and agreed. It felt good to say yes to things again without wondering what kind of trap lay behind them. When the weekend came, the whole community showed up. The air was filled with the smell of grilled food and music. Kids ran around with sparklers while adults sat in folding chairs, sharing stories. At some point, someone raised a toast to a drama-free HOA, and everyone laughed. As the night went on, a small group gathered near the lake's edge, swapping stories about Karen. It was strange how she had become more of a legend than a memory, a cautionary tale wrapped in laughter. Some joked that she was probably trying to run a boat committee in her new neighborhood. Others swore they'd seen her name on a local online forum, complaining about unregulated property aesthetics. I didn't contribute much to the conversation, just listened and smiled. I didn't hate her anymore. She had already paid her price, not just through fines and embarrassment, but through isolation. People like her thrived on control, and when that control is taken away, it leaves a kind of emptiness that punishment can't fix. I figured that was lesson enough. As the evening wind picked up, I walked down to my dock alone. The lake reflected the glow of string lights from the shore, and the gentle hum of conversation drifted across the water. I thought about everything that had happened, the first fine, the investigation, the Coast Guard showing up, the humiliation, and finally the calm. It all seemed distant now, like a story I'd once heard rather than lived. I could almost laugh at how absurd it had been, how something as simple as a fishing boat had unleashed a chain of events that reshaped an entire community. The truth was, I had never wanted revenge. All I had wanted was peace, the kind of quiet that comes from fairness and respect. But sometimes peace requires a little chaos to remind people why it matters. Later that night, I sat on the porch with Alan, both of us drinking coffee as the last guests drifted home. He looked out at the lake and said he still couldn't believe how everything had changed so quickly. I told him it hadn't been quick. It just felt that way now because we were finally on the other side of it. He asked if I'd ever thought about running the HOA myself, said the community trusted me more than anyone. I laughed and shook my head. I told him I preferred being the guy who quietly keeps the boat tied down right, not the one who tells others how to tie theirs. He nodded, understanding completely. Leadership had never been my goal, peace had. A few days later, something unexpected happened. I got an envelope with no return address, postmarked from a neighboring town. Inside was a single piece of paper with neat handwriting. It was from Karen. The letter was short, surprisingly humble. She wrote that she had moved into a smaller lakeside community about 50 miles away and was starting fresh. She said she realized now how much her obsession with rules had blinded her, that she had become the kind of person she once hated. She didn't apologize directly, but between the lines, it was there. She ended the letter with a simple sentence: "You were right to stand up to me." I sat with that for a long time, unsure how to feel. Maybe it was closure, maybe it was just words, but it felt like a full circle moment. I didn't reply. Some things are better left unsaid, and I didn't want to reopen old wounds. But for the first time, I felt like she truly understood the cost of her actions. As summer turned to fall, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. The air grew cooler, the trees painted the sky with reds and golds, and the lake reflected everything with quiet dignity. On one particularly calm evening, I took the boat out alone, cutting softly through the still water. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting everything in amber light. I thought about how far things had come, from fines and false authority to laughter and freedom. The story that began with petty control had ended with peace. As I steered toward the middle of the lake, I felt the same kind of contentment that comes after a long storm when the air smells clean again. When I finally returned to shore, I tied the boat carefully, the way I always did, making sure every knot was tight and precise. For a moment, I looked across the water toward where Karen's dock used to be. The new owners had rebuilt it, simple and sturdy, no nonsense, just a dock, no rules, no drama. It was the perfect symbol of how everything had healed. As the last bit of daylight faded and the crickets began their steady rhythm, I took a deep breath of the cool air and smiled. The lake was calm, the neighborhood was free, and the ghosts of old battles had finally sunk beneath the surface. Whatever came next, I knew we'd earned this peace. And this time it would stay.